Welcome. Today we're doing a comprehensive exploration of a life that was really defined by, well, both dedication and intense conflict.
Hmm.
We're focusing on Dian Fossey, the American primatologist who spent 2 decades becoming the fiercest protector of the mountain gorillas in Rwanda's Virunga Mountains.
It's a story that has everything. There's a profound scientific breakthrough, but also this aggressive, often, very controversial conservation effort.
And it all culminates in a tragic, violent end that to this day remains shrouded in a lot of mystery.
Right. And for this, we're synthesizing quite a lot of material. Detailed biographical accounts, her own scientific papers, and records of her conservation work to give you a really clear, comprehensive understanding of her life.
And not just her life, but the escalating tensions that, ultimately led to her unsolved murder in 1985.
We're really tracing the journey of a woman who didn't just observe an endangered species, she essentially went to war for them.
She absolutely did. And when you hear the name Dian Fossey, you almost instantly think of that iconic image, right? A human being just accepted into a gorilla family.
She completely changed the world's perception of these animals.
She did. She transformed them from these, mythic, aggressive beasts into what she so lovingly called them dignified, highly social, gentle giants.
Well, her significance, both scientifically and politically, you really can't overstate it.
Right.
Fossey is one of the three seminal figures known as the primates.
Right.
These were three women, all recruited by the legendary paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey to conduct these long-term field studies on great apes in their natural habitats.
You had Jane Goodall with the chimpanzees, Baruta Galdikas with orangutans, and then Fossey.
Exactly. And Fossey, she really established the gold standard for primatology. Her scientific commitment, when you combine it with her intense, almost radical conservation measures, directly contributed to reversing the population decline in mountain gorillas.
And they were on the brink of extinction when she arrived.
They really were.
Yeah.
But as you said, the shadow hanging over this whole story is her final years. She spent 20 years, think about that, 2 decades, living high on a cold, damp mountain, completely dedicated to gorilla protection.
Until she was brutally murdered in December of 1985.
Yeah.
So our purpose here in looking at this material is to really understand the origins of that drive, her remarkable achievements, and the very complex web of political, financial, and personal hostilities that all converged on her camp, Karisoke, that night. And to really grasp the intensity of Dian Fossey's drive in Africa, I think we have to look back at her childhood. It really seems her early years were marked by a lot of emotional hardship.
Yeah, and this search for acceptance that she, it seems, only really found in animals.
Tell us about her origins.
So Diane was born in San Francisco in 1932. Her parents, Hazel, a fashion model, and George, a real estate agent, they divorced when she was just 6.
So instability from a very young age.
Right, and that was immediately compounded when her mother remarried a man named Richard Price, a wealthy businessman. And the sources, they really depict Price as this figure who enforced very strict discipline, but offered very little, emotional warmth or support to his stepdaughter.
And it's those small, chilling details that often define a personality. We learn from the sources that her stepfather, Price, wouldn't even allow her to sit at the main dining room table with him and her mother during dinner.
That's just, that kind of profound isolation, that exclusion, it seems to have really cemented a deep sense of personal insecurity in Fossey.
Which is the crucial context for her later life, isn't it? She turned to animals for that unconditional acceptance, that stability that she just couldn't find at home.
Exactly. She famously started with a pet goldfish, but her passion for animals grew quickly. But when it came time for college, her stepfather, he insisted she follow a more conservative path.
So she initially enrolled in a business course.
At the College of Marin, yes. A direction that was completely opposite to her natural inclinations.
It sounds like a formula for unhappiness. Where did she finally break away from that path that was imposed on her?
Well, the rebellion, you could say, it started after a summer she spent on a ranch in Montana when she was 19. That time just re-engaged her deep connection with the natural world.
So she defied him.
She did. She defied her stepfather's wishes, switched directions, and enrolled in a pre-veterinary course at the University of California, Davis.
But that shift, it wasn't seamless. The sources note she found the academic side of it for veterinary science particularly challenging.
That's a key detail that's often overlooked. She struggled, really struggled, with the required hard sciences, specifically chemistry and physics.
And that led to her failing her second year.
It did, which forced her to pivot again. She transferred to San Jose State College, where she eventually earned a bachelor's degree in occupational therapy in 1954.
Occupational therapy, a field focused on rehabilitation, helping people engage in daily life. I mean, that seems miles away from field primatology in a remote jungle.
It does. And she pursued it initially. She interned and worked with tuberculosis patients in California.
But how did that experience connect with the remote mountains of Africa all those years later?
Well, the connection is actually profound. It really speaks to the unexpected ways that skills can transfer. After she graduated, she moved to Kentucky, drawn there partly by her equestrian skills, and she took a job at the Corsair Crippled Children's Hospital in Louisville in 1956.
And she was successful there.
Very. Her colleagues observed that her shy and reserved personality actually made her an excellent therapist. She excelled at these quiet, non-confrontational interactions with the children.
So she was developing skills in patience, in quiet observation, and building trust without relying on, verbal communication.
Precisely. And she acknowledged this herself. Later on, she openly attributed her extraordinary success in habituating these incredibly shy wild mountain gorillas who had only known humans as poachers to her experience working as an occupational therapist with children with autism.
So it taught her how to approach another inhibited, reserved personality without being a threat.
Exactly. Using only these subtle behavioral cues, it reframes her success completely. It wasn't just a scientific methodology, it was this deeply personal application of her therapeutic training.
And it's also worth noting, given the challenges she faced later securing funding, that she had this long history of financial independence.
Yes, the sources really emphasize that. Her parents offered very little substantial financial support in her adult life, so she was forced to support herself through a string of, demanding, often low-paying jobs. Clerking, laboratory work, factory jobs.
That background is critical. She was fundamentally self-reliant, resilient, and accustomed to hardship.
All traits that were absolutely necessary for survival and work high up in the cold, dangerous Virungas.
And that self-reliance, that desire for adventure, it all culminated in this pivotal trip that changed the trajectory of her life forever in 1963.
Yeah, and this wasn't just a casual vacation. It was an enormous calculated risk. Fossey borrowed $8,000, which was her entire annual salary at the time.
Wow.
And she used all her life savings to fund a 7-week visit to Africa. She was just determined to see the wildlife she'd only ever read about.
And she certainly didn't choose the easy route. Her itinerary was, exhaustive. Famous stops like Savo, Lake Minyora, the Ngorongoro crater.
But the most significant part of that journey was her visit to Mount Mekono in the Congo. This was the same site where the American zoologist George Schaller had done his pioneering gorilla studies just a few years earlier.
And this ambition, it led her straight to the center of the primatology universe at that time, Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania.
Right. And there she met the celebrated paleoanthropologists Louis and Mary Leakey.
The kingmaker himself.
Absolutely. And Leakey, who was already known for sponsoring Jane Goodall, was extremely impressed by Fossey's passion, even though she had no formal field experience. He really impressed upon her the scientific necessity of long-term intensive research on great apes.
She was a woman on a mission, too. The sources say she actually broke her ankle while visiting the Leakeys.
And she refused to end her trip. Her determination was legendary, even then.
So she just kept going.
Kept going.
Yeah.
She traveled to the Travelers Rest Hotel in Uganda. This was a crucial hub owned by the guerrilla advocate Walter Baumgartel. And there, she met wildlife photographers Joan and Alan Root.
And that's where it happened?
That's where it happened. It was during a few days of camping near the Roots, high up in the Misty Mountains, that Fossey had her first direct, life-altering encounter with wild mountain gorillas. She described that moment as the most transcendent experience of her life.
Of course, she had to return home eventually to pay off that huge loan.
Yeah.
She spent 3 years back in Louisville, working and publishing a few articles about her trip in the local paper, just trying to keep the dream alive.
And then fate intervened again. 3 years after they first met, Leakey was on a lecture tour in Louisville, and he remembered her. He saw her continued passion, and he formally suggested she undertake a long-term study of the mountain gorillas, identical in scope to what Goodall was doing with chimps.
This was the moment, the opportunities she had been waiting for.
And this is where the preparation got really serious. Leakey lined up the initial funding, and Fossey immediately resigned from her hospital job. The commitment was total.
Right.
She spent 8 intensive months just preparing, This involved, navigating the bureaucracy of securing funding and visas, studying Swahili, and auditing a dedicated primatology class to ground herself in the academic methodology.
And by December 1966, she was on a plane back to Nairobi.
Ready to begin her new life. But she didn't just rush into the jungle. She followed protocol.
She sought out her peers.
That's right. Before setting up her own camp, she spent time at the Gombe Stream Research Center to meet Jane Goodall, to familiarize herself with the established research protocols for observing great apes.
Which was smart.
Very. Then she traveled with Alan Root, who not only helped her get the permits, but also accompanied her to Kabara in the Congo in early 1967. This is the exact site Scheller had used, and Root provided that initial crucial training in guerrilla tracking and just basic field survival skills.
So Fossey's initial foray into field research in the Congo, while it was scientifically productive, it was, you could say, politically doomed from...
Right in the middle of the Congo crisis. The political climate was just highly unstable, constant civil unrest, rebellion.
This required a level of vigilance far beyond just her research needs.
Oh, absolutely. The physical environment alone was brutal. Living in tents, hiking through constant rain, navigating extreme terrain, but the threat from the conflict was far more immediate.
And in July 1967, less than a year in, soldiers arrived at her camp.
They did. They escorted her down the mountain, and she was detained at a place called Rumangabo for 2 weeks. This was a moment of real, genuine danger for her.
But she managed to escape, which required, considerable bravery and resourcefulness.
She escaped by successfully bribing the guards and made her way to the Travelers Rest Hotel in Uganda. And interestingly, her escort was arrested by the Ugandan military right after her escape.
So, given the severity of the situation, she was advised not to go back.
Strongly advised. After meeting with Leakey in Nairobi, they agreed to restart her study immediately, but on the relatively safer Rwandan side of the Virungas Mountains.
And this is where her permanent legacy was forged. Some local expatriates, Rosamond Carr and Aliette the Monk, they played a vital role in helping her find a suitable and stable site for her new research base.
And this led directly to the founding of the legendary Karisoke Research Center on September 24, 1967.
The name itself is a combination of the two mountains it sits between.
Right, it sits high in this remote saddle at 3,000 meters, nestled between Mount Karisembikari and Mount Basoksok. The study area she defined was about 25 square kilometers.
And the sheer altitude, the dampness, the cold, it meant working there was incredibly physically taxing.
Which led to a high turnover rate among the research students who later joined her.
Now, the gorillas on the Rwandan side were different from the ones Scheller had studied. They were extremely shy. They'd learned to associate humans not with harmless observation, but with poaching and danger. How did she manage to overcome that intense wariness?
This is where her occupational therapy background gave her that breakthrough advantage. She didn't charge in. She used imitation and submission.
What did that look like?
Well, her key to habituation was mimicking gorilla actions. Beating her chest gently, making these soft, non-threatening grunting sounds, exhibiting submissive postures, and crucially, publicly eating the local celery plant to show she was consuming the same food and posed no threat.
That concept of identifying with the species is just fascinating.
It's deeply insightful. She reflected on this later in a BBC interview in 1984. She said that because she herself was an inhibited persona and she felt the gorillas were similarly reserved, she just imitated their natural, normal behavior to gain acceptance.
It was a form of mirroring based on a kind of shared isolation.
You can say that. And the local community, they recognized her unique, solitary presence. They gave her a name that reflected her status. Nyiramachabeli, or Nyiramachabiri.
Which translates roughly to the woman who lives alone on the mountain.
Exactly. And scientifically, her work was meticulous. She employed and refined the techniques that Scheller had pioneered, relying heavily on individual nose prints, the unique ridges and patterns on their noses, for accurate identification. First through detailed sketching, and later with a camera.
And her research results quickly began redefining the entire species in the global consciousness. What were some of her most significant scientific findings during those early productive years?
Her long-term observations provided crucial data on their social structure and behavior. Key discoveries included detailing the complex phenomenon of female transfer between groups, which often happens to prevent inbreeding.
She also cataloged their vocalizations.
Yes, providing this comprehensive catalog of their complex vocalization patterns, which revealed a much greater depth of communication than was previously understood, differentiating between, say, alarm calls and cohesion calls, and she clarified the social hierarchies and relationships within the groups.
She also made important observations about their diet.
Right, she documented their diet and consumption patterns, including the fascinating detail of how they recycle nutrients, which is a key physiological adaptation to their habitat.
And perhaps most dramatically, she meticulously documented the rare, brutal practice of infanticide within gorilla groups.
A phenomenon that was previously unknown in the species. And it implied these deeper, more complex internal political dynamics regarding group takeovers and reproductive strategy.
Her dedication was matched by her rising global profile. She was funded primarily by the National Geographic Society, and in 1970, she appeared on the cover of National Geographic magazine.
And that exposure brought immediate, massive global attention to her work and, critically, to the mountain gorilla's precarious existence.
And at the same time, she solidified her academic standing.
She did. After returning briefly for study, she got her PhD in zoology from Darwin College, Cambridge in 1976. By 1980, there was no question. She was the world's foremost authority on mountain gorilla physiology and behavior.
And her enduring description of them as dignified, highly social, gentle giants with individual personalities and strong family relationships, that's the image that stuck.
It is. This academic success gave her a platform. She lectured at Cornell from 81 to 83, and her research formed the basis of her best-selling book, Gorillas in the Mist, in 1983.
The book received widespread praise, including from Nobel laureate Nicholas Tinbergen. It's still the definitive text on gorillas. But as her academic legitimacy grew, so did the violence around her, transforming her work from pure research into outright warfare.
The shift from dedicated researcher to aggressive conservationist, it really stemmed from a bitter realization. The legal framework that was supposed to protect the gorillas was systematically failing.
And often the supposed protectors were complicit in the destruction.
Exactly. Hunting was technically illegal in the Virunga Volcanoes National Park since the 1920s. But this law was seldom, if ever, enforced by park conservators.
Why not?
Well, the sources indicate that these officials were often allegedly bribed by poachers. And compounding the issue, the conservators themselves were paid less than Fossey's own African field staff. So there was this massive incentive for corruption, for turning a blind eye to illegal activity like setting snares for antelopes.
Snares that would accidentally trap and kill gorillas.
Right. But the worst systematic problem she faced, the one that really infuriated her and radicalized her approach, was the kidnapping of infant gorillas for zoos.
That must have been horrific to witness.
She documented the aftermath of these capture attempts on 3 separate occasions. And these attempts were particularly brutal because adult gorillas will fight, often to the death, to protect their young. So a single kidnapping attempt could result in the deaths of up to 10 adult gorillas.
And critically, these kidnappings were sometimes carried out with the cooperation of the park conservators themselves.
Yes, who profited from the trade. There was a major heartbreaking event in 1978 involving 2 infants, Coco and Pucker.
Tell us about that.
Coco and Pucker were 2 young gorillas captured for the Cologne Zoo in Germany. This single capture incident resulted in the deaths of 20 adult gorillas in the process.
20.
Fossey worked desperately to treat the severe injuries the infants had suffered during their captured deep spear wounds, but despite her immense objections, they were shipped to Cologne. They survived 9 years in captivity, but died in the same month in 1987.
And for Fossey, this confirmed her absolute conviction.
He did. That holding these highly social, intelligent animals in what she called a prison for human entertainment was profoundly unethical and directly contributed to the slaughter of the adults in the wild.
This relentless pressure eventually led to the critical turning point, the event that truly crystallized her militant attitude, the murder of her favorite gorilla, Digit.
This happened around New Year's Eve, 1977. Digit was a 12-year-old silverback, the sentry of Group 4, one of the groups she'd spent years habituating.
And he was killed defending the group.
From 6 poachers and their dogs, who stumbled across them while they were checking antelope trap lines, Digit sustained 5 spear wounds, but in this incredible act of sacrifice, he managed to kill one of the dogs and successfully allowed the other 13 members of Group 4 to escape.
But the ultimate brutality of the act was the desecration of his body.
It was horrific. Digit was decapitated, and his hands were cut off. This was done because gorilla heads and hands could be sold illegally, often destined to be turned into these grotesque souvenirs like ashtrays or wall trophies.
She described this loss as the saddest event in all my years.
It absolutely shattered her. The sources detail that the event plunged her into a deep, prolonged depression. She isolated herself, her alcohol consumption increased significantly, and she relied heavily on cigarettes. Her focus shifted entirely from pure objective science to vengeance and immediate protection.
And she got some measure of justice.
She did. After Digit's mutilated body was discovered by her assistant Ian Redmond, her staff captured one of the killers. He named 5 accomplices, and 3 were eventually imprisoned. It really showed her capacity for direct action.
And the Digit Fund was founded as a direct response to this tragedy.
Yes, established specifically to finance active conservation patrols. This was the official beginning of her war on poaching.
And the effectiveness of her direct action compared to the official enforcement was just astonishing.
It really was. For instance, in just 4 months in 1979, the Fossey Patrol, just 4 African staffers, destroyed 987 poacher traps in the vicinity of Karisoke.
And during that same period, the official park guards.
The 24 official Rwandan National Park guards destroyed 0 traps. 0.
That vast discrepancy fueled the ideological conflict between her approach and the major international organizations. She represented active conservation using direct physical intervention.
Versus what she scornfully called theoretical conservation.
This conflict became financial, too.
It did. She publicly and vehemently claimed that large international organizations like the World Wildlife Fund and the African Wildlife Foundation were misdirecting public donations. The public thought their money was supporting her anti-poaching patrols.
But she alleged the funding was being channeled elsewhere.
Right. Into tourism development, equipment for Rwandan park officials, who she often viewed as corrupt and involved in poaching, and paying the extensive airfare for what she called so-called conservationists who will never go on anti-poaching patrols.
She saw an active prioritization of tourism revenue over the immediate safety of the gorillas. And this division, it just solidified her image as a rogue element.
And sadly, the violence didn't stop with Digit. Later in 1978, the silverback of Group 4, Uncle Bert, was shot directly in the heart while trying to save his son, Kweli, from poachers.
And these poachers were reportedly collaborating with the park conservator.
Directly. Kweli's mother, Macho, was also killed. And Kweli, he escaped the immediate conflict, but succumbed slowly and painfully to gangrene from a poacher's bullet graze. These relentless losses only cemented her radical approach as the necessary response to bureaucratic failure and corruption.
The deaths of her most beloved gorillas caused Fossey to, radically abandon the traditional role of a scientific researcher.
Her singular focus became warfare. She almost entirely stopped scientific publishing, dedicating herself solely to physical prevention of poaching.
And this led to a dramatic escalation in her tactics, moving far beyond just trap destruction. We have to address the nature of her direct action against the local people.
Her methods became increasingly extreme and, often illegal under Rwandan law. She and her staff intensified their physical protection measures. They continued to cut traps, but they also moved into direct confrontation.
They would chase down and capture poachers.
Yes, and humiliate them. They held the poachers' cattle for ransom, burned their hunting camps to the ground, and even, according to source reports, burned the mats from their houses as a form of retribution.
She was essentially operating outside the law using psychological intimidation.
Absolutely. She developed this complex system of psychological warfare. It was designed to mystify and terrify poachers who were often deeply superstitious. She wore face masks, pretended to practice black magic or witchcraft, claiming to curse them.
And when she'd go back to the U.S., she'd stock up on things to help with this.
She would. She'd load up on firecrackers, cheap toys, and magic tricks specifically to enhance this persona and scare away anyone who encroached on her territory.
And some of the specific actions detailed in the sources are extremely violent, and, they raise major ethical and legal red flags.
Yes, the reports are disturbing. She was reported to have captured and held Rwandans she is suspected of poaching. And in a letter she wrote to a friend, she described in explicit detail stripping a suspect, claiming she spread-eagled him and lashed the holy blue sweat out of him with nettle stalks and leaves.
Which causes intense pain and blistering.
Yes. And there are also allegations that she allegedly kidnapped and held for ransom the child of a suspected poacher to force him to reveal accomplices or stop his activities.
This goes far beyond conservation. This sounds like criminal activity. How did the diplomatic community react to a U.S. citizen doing this? And how did the major conservation groups capitalize on this to undermine her?
Well, this ruthlessness severely isolated her. According to her correspondence, the ORTPN, the Rwandan government agency responsible for park management and heavily invested in tourism, and the international conservation groups who favored a tourism-based model, they allegedly began a campaign to actively wrest control of Karisoke from her.
They successfully portrayed her as unstable.
Unstable, cruel, and ineffective, arguing that her methods were antiquated and counterproductive, especially when compared to the revenue-generating potential of guerrilla tourism.
That reputational damage was immense and appears to have had racial overtones as well, given her isolation.
That perspective was certainly voiced externally. A journalist writing in 2002 offered a very harsh description of Fossey toward the end of her life, calling her colorful, controversial, and a racist alcoholic who regarded her guerrillas as better than the African people who lived around them.
And regardless of the factual accuracy of that extreme description, it illustrates the sheer toxicity of the environment.
Exactly. And the extent of the political and reputational damage she had incurred by that point. She was battling government corruption, the financial strategies of international NGOs, all while battling poachers directly on the ground.
And on top of that external warfare, she was also battling an internal collapse due to her health and personal life.
She was suffering greatly. She had advanced emphysema caused by years of heavy cigarette smoking. And this condition was severely aggravated by the extreme high altitude and the damp, cold climate of Karisoke.
She often required an oxygen tank.
Yes, just to climb or hike long distances. And her singular dedication, it destroyed her personal relationships.
Completely. She had a profound relationship with the National Geographic photographer Bob Campbell, who documented her work.
But their affair ended because she was unable to choose a life with him over her absolute total dedication to the guerrillas and to Karisoke.
There's a very telling anecdote from earlier in her career.
The one about her abortion in 1970.
Yes. She reportedly commented that you can't be a cover girl for National Geographic magazine and be pregnant. And that single statement, it just encapsulates the extreme sacrifice and singular focus that was required of her.
It does. And her final major point of contention, the one that put her directly against the financial interests of the Rwandan government and the tourism-focused NGOs, was her absolute opposition to guerrilla tourism.
Her opposition was purely scientific and epidemiological.
It was. She argued vehemently against wildlife tourism because gorillas, being genetically so close to us, are highly susceptible to what are called anthropogenic diseases, diseases originating in humans.
Things like influenza.
Influenza, common respiratory viruses, bacterial infections, things against which the gorillas had limited or zero immunity. She documented multiple cases where gorillas died due to diseases that she believed were transmitted directly by researchers, tourists, or park staff.
So she viewed tourism as a profound interference with their natural behavior and a direct threat to their survival, regardless of the revenue it generated.
And that position made her a genuine obstacle to the financial plans of the Rwandan government.
This intense, volatile environment full of financial and personal hostility, it all ultimately culminated in the unspeakable tragedy of her murder. Early in the morning, December 27, 1985.
It's just, after dedicating decades to fighting for the lives of others, for her own to be taken in such a brutal and senseless attack is a profound tragedy.
The scene was gruesome. Fossey was discovered murdered in the bedroom of her cabin, which was at the far edge of the remote Karisoke camp.
Her body was found near her two beds.
The discovery was made by Wayne Richard McGuire, who was her last research assistant. He'd been summoned by the house servant. And McGuire reported the brutality of the attack. Her face had been split diagonally with a single, massive machete blow.
The location suggests a high degree of intent. The room was violently ransacked, broken glass, overturned furniture everywhere. But the immediate puzzle for investigators was the motive.
Robbery was clearly not the goal.
No. Numerous high-value items, her passport, multiple handguns, thousands of dollars in U.S. bills, and traveler's checks. They were all still in the cabin.
And the assailant didn't use the door or a window.
No, the only visible access point was a hole that had been deliberately cut into the wall of her cabin. A 9mm handgun and ammunition were found beside her body on the floor, suggesting some kind of desperate struggle.
It's chilling to read her final written words found in her diary. They really reflect this desire to focus on the future despite all the strife she was in.
What did it say?
Her last entry read, "When you realize the value of all life, you dwell less on what is past and concentrate more on the preservation of the future."
The immediate aftermath of the murder was defined by chaos and suspicion. The Rwandan authorities initially arrested her entire staff.
including a tracker who had recently been fired.
Yes, Emmanuel Rilicana. He was a known source of friction, and the subsequent government trial account alleged that he previously attempted to kill Fossey.
But all of the arrested staff were eventually released.
All except for Rilicana. He was later found dead in prison. The official ruling was a self-inflicted death by hanging.
So the conviction that followed was highly controversial, resting in absentia upon her American research assistant, Wayne McGuire.
That's correct. McGuire had returned to the U.S. in July 1987. The Rwandan courts conducted a trial without him present, convicted him in absentia, and sentenced him to death by a firing squad.
And the prosecution's theory was extraordinary.
It was. They alleged that McGuire murdered Fossey to steal the manuscript for the sequel to Gorillas in the Mist. Investigators claimed he was dissatisfied with his own scientific research and wanted to use any dishonest means possible to advance his career by appropriating her final work.
And since there was no extradition treaty, McGuire remained free in the U.S.
He did. He vehemently denied the charges, calling them outrageous and maintaining that Fossey had been his friend and mentor. But despite avoiding prison, the conviction haunted his career. A job offer he got in Nebraska in 2005 was publicly revoked when they discovered his connection to the case.
Because the official conclusion relies on such a weak, almost self-serving motive, a manuscript theft, multiple alternative theories about her murder have persisted for decades.
And they link directly back to the aggressive conflicts she created in her final years.
Let's detail the range of perpetrators suggested by the sources, linking them back to the interests she opposed.
Well, first, there's the simplest theory. Revenge. She could have been killed by poachers she had physically assaulted, humiliated, or whose homes she'd burned. Given her extreme tactics, revenge was a very high possibility.
Right.
Secondly, there were theories involving organized crime or those interested in her research. Some speculated she was killed by Zairoy hitmen specifically hired to steal her research notes, which contained decades of highly valuable data.
And the political and financial motives must also be considered, linking back to the tourism revenues.
Absolutely. The third theory links the murder to organized interests negatively affected by her anti-exploitation campaign. Fossey had positioned herself against the powerful Rwandan tourism sector and the high-level officials who profited from it.
There was also a more specific theory.
A fourth one, yes. It suggests she may have been killed by a panicked burglar who was hired to steal a specific item, a protective talisman she had previously confiscated from a high-profile poacher.
And finally, there was the allegation that she held evidence of gold smuggling.
Right. That she was killed because she knew about regional gold smugglers who were using the cover of the Virunga Park boundaries to move their illegal product.
The lack of consensus just underscores how many powerful, financially motivated interests were aligned against her. Ultimately, she found her final resting place at Karisoke.
In a grave she had personally constructed for her deceased gorilla friends. She was placed right beside Digit, and near the other poached gorillas she had tried so fiercely to protect.
The final aspect of her life involved a complicated legal battle over her estate.
She had left an unsigned will, which bequeathed all of her estate, including film proceeds and royalties, to the Digit Fund, specifically earmarking the money for anti-poaching patrols.
But the will was unsigned.
And it was successfully challenged by her estranged mother, Hazel Fossey Price, who was legally awarded the estate. This included approximately $4.9 million in royalties, money that Fossey had intended to fuel her direct conservation war.
Despite the tragedy, the controversy, and that legal battle, Fossey is overwhelmingly credited with achieving the one goal that mattered most to her. She successfully reversed the population decline of the mountain gorilla.
That is her ultimate, enduring legacy. Before her focused intervention, the gorilla populations had declined precipitously. They dropped from 450 in 1960 to a terrifying low of only 250 by 1981.
And after her sustained war on poaching, the tide began to turn.
It did. The last confirmed killing of a gorilla occurred in 1983. By the late 1980s, the population had risen to 280, and critically, the population has continued to steadily increase since then. It's a direct testament to the effectiveness of her fierce protection methods, whatever the ethical complexities around them.
The Karisoke Research Center survived her. Today, the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund International continues the daily gorilla monitoring and protection she pioneered.
But the facility itself suffered terribly in the subsequent years. Between her death and the 1994 Rwandan genocide, the camp was overseen by former students, some of whom had publicly opposed her. But during the widespread violence of the genocide, the camp was completely looted and destroyed.
Her life, her book, and her death achieved a kind of global permanence in the 1988 film Gorillas in the Mist, starring Sigourney Weaver.
That film ensured her story reached a global audience. It notably portrayed her ruthlessness toward poachers, and, unlike her own edited account in her book, it included the major subplot of her affair with Bob Campbell.
And Weaver's performance was incredible. It earned her both a Golden Globe and an Oscar nomination, cementing Fossey's image as this complex, driven, and ultimately tragic heroine.
So what we have explored today is a life that fused ethology, conservation, and radical intervention. Dian Fossey left behind a conflicted but overwhelmingly positive legacy that successfully sparked global awareness of the mountain gorilla's intelligence and sapience.
And ensured its survival into the 21st century.
It truly boils down to that fundamental tension she experienced and fought against, the purity of her singular dedication versus the practical realities of conservation politics and financial necessity.
Oh.
She fought vehemently against wildlife tourism, citing the high risk of disease transmission and behavioral interference as primary threats to the species.
Yet today, the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund International actively promotes gorilla tourism. They argue that the revenue generated helps create a stable, economically viable local community that is dedicated to the long-term protection of the gorillas and their habitat.
And this local incentive is seen by many as the only sustainable path forward.
Which raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider as you reflect on this information. If Dian Fossey opposed tourism with such intensity because of the inherent documented risks of disease and interference with the gorilla's natural behavior,
Does the current successful strategy, which relies heavily on tourism revenue to keep population numbers rising, truly honor her ultimate non-interventionist goal?
or does it represent the exact political and commercial compromise that she desperately and ultimately fatally fought to avoid?
Something profound to ponder.
Thank you for joining us for this extensive exploration of the sources surrounding Dian Fossey's remarkable and tragic life.
Thanks for listening.